Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Jerry Simon, a League member and your host. Each program we talk about important public policy issues. We hope you'll discuss those same issues and that at election time you'll be informed and ready to vote. This program we're going to talk about understanding hemp and hemp farming in Nebraska. And our guest to do that is David Brocht. He's an attorney with the Omaha law firm of Q-Tac Rock. And he works in agribusiness, compliance regulations, and he's worked with the Nebraska Farmers Union on this issue. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Jerry.
Thank you. Well, let's talk first and distinguish,
Sure.
which is confusing for a lot of people. Hemp versus marijuana or medical marijuana, are they the same thing?
So they're the same plant, but just different varieties of the same plant. You might think about it like blue corn, like you'd have blue corn chips and yellow corn chips. So again, from the plant standpoint, it's the same, just a variety, so some different characteristics.
Okay. And so what is it, industrial hemp, something different from?
So that's it's both a physical question and a legal question.
Okay.
So from a legal standpoint, what's considered hemp is if it has not more than 0.3% of THC, which is the acronym for a longer chemical name. That's the component of marijuana that makes marijuana psychoactive or gives people the high.
Right.
So from a legal standpoint, it's the plants that marijuana has more than that 0.3%, hemp has less. And then, as I said, the plant itself then is really just a different variety. Some plants have more THC than others.
Okay. So if that's the case, why has hemp farming been so controversial? I mean, some people are saying it's going to pave the way to allowing marijuana use, legalize it for any and all purposes.
You bet. So the distinction that 0.3% is a relatively recent one under the law. And in fact, for everything, including the United States drug laws, that's only been since about a year ago in the 2018 Farm Bill. That 0.3% first came out through the 2014 Farm Bill. But before then, in fact, at the beginning of the last century, both marijuana and hemp, because it was basically the same plant, started falling out of favor. And in fact, marijuana was made illegal then, and consequently hemp, by the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. And so they were both illegal starting in 1970 until last December.
Okay. Nebraska, under that 2014 bill, did allow some farming or growing of hemp. And can you talk about that a little bit?
So the 2014 Farm Bill established really a research program, really with the intent of letting all the different states kind of think about how they wanted to try and allow the opportunity for hemp. Different states approached it in different ways. Here in Nebraska, it was very focused on the University of Nebraska. So really, it was only through the university and in fact at the University of Nebraska's research farm that they actually had any hemp growing since the 2014 Farm Bill.
Okay. And in Nebraska is one of the states that passed its own state legislation besides the Farm Bill. Why did we go that route?
So
why did we do that?
What's contemplated in the Farm Bill is that each state should get to do what they want to do. And so the Farm Bill essentially set out a particular template, and then the states could choose. And Nebraska, in fact, I think almost all of the states, 46 or 47 states, have now passed something to move forward with hemp.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more, and you can give more detail about the specific provisions of the Farm Bill that authorize hemp farming.
So again, it was really a template, and it set some basic standards that all of the state plans would have to follow. And the concept again is that the 2018 Farm Bill said to USDA, you write a standard plan that has these requirements, and essentially it was that it can't have more than 0.3% THC, some testing criteria, some criteria to make sure that the states would know where this product is being grown. And the concern there is that under the law, and I think of the lawmakers, was that you couldn't have a situation where someone was saying I'm growing hemp, but when they're actually growing the illegal product, the marijuana.
Okay.
So USDA set out those main criteria, plus there's some other ones, and then at the end of October issued the first set of the draft regulations that apply to that.
Okay. And well, besides the testing criteria, there's a lot of reporting requirements as well, is it not? And you have to identify where your crops are located.
That's exactly right. And so the concept behind it is because it's so closely related to this product that's otherwise illegal, that for law enforcement and other purposes to track where it's being planted, when it's harvested, where does it go. And so the USDA regulations really follow that, and our Nebraska Hemp Farming Act follows that, and in fact then would require not only where it's at, but who's doing all of those things. Mm-hmm. So it'll be an application process that a grower, a farmer will have to apply, meet some certain requirements, then it'd be issued a permit or a license, and that they have to have in order to grow.
Okay, and that did happen in 2019, did it not? We had an application process to actually go beyond growing it for research purposes.
So only sort of. So in fact, what happened in 2019, and this was true in most of the states, because there had been no program before, what both the Farm Bill and then our Nebraska Hemp Farming Act said is we're going to follow the same rules that had been in 2014. Now in Nebraska we said, well, it wasn't we wanted to do more than just the university. Mm-hmm. So it allowed the Nebraska Department of Agriculture to select at random. So it wasn't a permit process other than meeting some specific requirements. Select at random, and they ended up selecting 10 farmers that could produce some for this year. Okay. Next year then is when we'll go through the full application and licensing program.
I see. But it was pretty, we had 176 applications come through. They chose the 10 from then.
That's right. And I think that that's a question that a lot of, certainly a lot of farmers who were interested had asked about it. And there's really two things I think to keep in mind there. First, because the state had not had any program before, they were really starting from scratch. And so being able to do very many acres at all would have been difficult. Second, the law didn't pass until the very end of May. Mm-hmm. And so then the state, the Nebraska Department of Ag came out with their pilot program, to use that word, in the random in June. Well, most people around Nebraska know that by your time you're into June, July, it's probably past the time to be growing. Right. And then I would add that we saw a huge increase in the acres this year across the country, mm-hmm. and to the point that there's real concerns about those farmers that did grow. Are they going to be able to get it processed? What's it going to be worth? And so it was probably appropriate to just have a small number of acres this year.
Okay. Well, you mentioned before one of the things covered in the state statute and certainly in the Farm Bill is the amount of THC mm-hmm. that can be in hemp crops. And 0.3% sounds pretty small. By comparison, I was looking at Iowa's medical marijuana law, and they only allow up to 3% in a medical product. Mm-hmm. So it's a small amount. But why is it so important to regulate it? Why is it so significant?
So again, I think there's two answers to that, and one has to do again with the relation of the THC, which is what makes marijuana illegal, mm-hmm. and the other components that are in it. So a sativus plant, a marijuana plant, actually has a variety of things. The THC is what gives people the high. The CBD, which is another one of the cannabinoids, is what's generally associated with the health benefits. Mm-hmm. And so the law, again, was set up not to allow expanded use of the illegal marijuana, but rather the lower. The second thing is that we've seen, and I think this is true of any time you have farmers growing something, including farmers that are growing things that are illegal, marijuana producers have dramatically increased the amount of THC in, say, the last 2 or 3 decades, certainly since, so that in the 70s and 80s, 3% would have been what you typically found in an illegal marijuana product. Mm-hmm. And so that's the other reason that I think the lower amount was chosen. Okay.
And then one thing we talked about was that it describes testing, and that's something that's been difficult to different ways of testing. I mean, I understand like there are Nebraska Crime Lab, they can't really distinguish between hemp marijuana plant
Sure.
with testing.
So, and again, I think, some of that's because this is a product that we hadn't had to try and distinguish just on the THC. So there was a variety of ways that law enforcement had in the past to be able to identify marijuana. Now really trying to narrow in on the THC, and there has been some testing, and I'm aware of one of the labs here in Omaha that's well on the way to being receiving the approval they need from the federal government to be a proper testing lab. So I think some of that science is going to be worked out and fairly quickly here.
So the state within its plan will designate which labs will be testing?
That's exactly right, and that's
Okay.
actually one of the requirements within the USDA program as well.
Okay. And then there must be guidelines as to how the farmer brings the crop for testing and how everything's handled.
And that's actually has been of the issues that probably caught some producers off guard within the USDA regulations is that a farmer will have to test within 15 days of harvest for that THC. And so that's going to require a whole lot of testing activity in a short period of time. On the other hand, the plant, as it's maturing, that really changes, and so that's what I understand was really determined. You couldn't expand it much further than that because at the end of the day, what the government's trying to determine is that it won't be more than 0.3% when it's harvested.
When it's harvested, okay. Okay, well, we mentioned you did CBD products. They're pretty much since the Farm Bill passed, I think you've seen all over the place. In Omaha, you see billboards, you walk into a store and the counter, CBD products are available for sale. But there's confusion about, I think, the legality of it and whether these products are marijuana. Are they still considered illegal?
Sure.
Even some places in Nebraska, we've had prosecution in some counties. I mean, Douglas County, I think the prosecutor says, I'm not going to bother with that. So does the Farm Bill deal with CBD products at all?
So in a manner of speaking, it does. And what it does in that way is it really says the FDA is going to be the federal government agency that's responsible for approval of CBD. And the reason for that, in part, is because the FDA has approved one drug product so far. It's called Epidiolex, and it's for juvenile epilepsy. And in fact, the University of Nebraska Medical Center was involved in some of the testing of that, I understand. And so it's been approved as a drug. Now, that actually complicates things, however, because once a drug is approved for some use, then the standard FDA rules would say it can't be in any other food or drug or food supplement without going through the full FDA testing. And that's created a lot of confusion and I would say a fair amount of ambiguity, both among the public and, for that matter, the legal community.
So there's no way of knowing the product that you're purchasing on the counter in the beauty store that says it's got CBD in it or CBD oil, what percentage, or if it really has it.
And that's really one of the biggest things right now is it's really a buyer beware kind of a marketplace today, because today the only product that has been approved by and for the use of with that CBD is that Epidiolex. Now, I'm sure a lot of your listeners and viewers are going to say, but Dave, as you said, I can walk down the street and find 3 different stores that are saying they have it. Part of that is just the ability. The market urge for it has been very significant, and so I think retailers and product producers are responding to that. And law enforcement has had to make some decisions on what can we spend our time doing. So there's a lot of ambiguity. And we're hoping that some of that gets cleared up by the FDA sooner rather than later. That's a long process, so I'm not sure how soon it will be. As I said, though, it is a buyer beware market. I was at a recent meeting when, in a different state, the Consumer Protection Bureau had sampled about 1,000 samples, and over 50% of them did not have the level of CBD that was indicated on the label. And in fact, 25% of them had no CBD. So consumers really need to be thoughtful and cautious about what they're using.
Okay. And the drug that has been approved is obviously is by prescription only, so
That's
you need
correct.
to see a physician for that.
For that
and
drug,
and
yes.
it's only been for the specific purpose of treating epilepsy in
That's
children.
correct. That's correct.
Okay. So that's something for people to really be
To
aware
really
of.
think about,
Yeah.
and hopefully it resolves itself so.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that, well, we talked about the USDA rules that have been just released by the USDA. And was there anything surprising in them, would you say? Are you noticing to tell clients about?
No, I think that in many respects the regulations followed very much what the USDA, what the Farm Bill told USDA it had to have. Certainly there's still some questions. Again, a conference I was at, there were members of the public saying, well, why did you pick 0.3%? And the answer, of course, is because that's what's in the law. So USDA didn't have much flexibility there. I think that the thing that probably caught the industry somewhat not thinking about it is that 15-day testing requirement. Because in the states that have had hemp programs, they didn't necessarily have that in the past.
Okay. And do states have much latitude in crafting their programs within the guidelines or using the guidelines?
So a state can choose to be more restrictive.
Okay.
And in fact, a state could choose to say, no, we don't want to have hemp grown in our state. I had mentioned 46 or 47 states that approved it. South Dakota, in fact, did not. So I think it'll wait to be seen how that is. But the key thing is that any state program that a state does try and implement has to be at least as restrictive or stringent as the federal program.
Federal program, okay. And is there anything that states cannot put into their program or their guidelines? That they're, for example, if somebody wanted to restrict what the hemp could be used for grown in your state, and
so I'd have to think about whether that particular aspect, but one
Okay.
thing that is really important that states very definitely can't do is a state, even if it were to say, we don't want to have any hemp in our state, it can't restrict interstate commerce. And that had been a really big issue, because if I had a state in one part of the country that has approved hemp and a buyer in another part of the country, there had been situations where when the poor truck driver was driving that hemp product across state lines, where he'd be stopped by the state.
Okay.
And so one of the things that both the law and the regulations say is a state can't stop interstate commerce and interstate transport.
okay. And then one thing to talk about within the guidelines in the state programs, how long will a farmer or a producer be authorized to license? Will it be a year? Will it be 3 years? Will it?
So it's a 3-year cycle. At least every 3 years, a farmer will have to go in and ask for a renewal. In those 3 years, they'll have to report where they've grown, where the product goes, and report on all the testing. And if they have violations, they can lose that permit in that period of time. But then they'd have to reapply every 3rd year.
Okay. And Nebraska limited it to a handful, 10 producers for the first year, knowing these regulations were
Sure.
coming. Will a state be able to, or will Nebraska be restricting the number of farmers or licenses they do grant? Or do we know?
Under the Nebraska Hemp Farming Act, the answer would be no. So while this year it was limited and it was contemplated that the department would only approve a certain number, once the application process and the regulations are issued, then what'll be is anyone who can meet the requirements would be able to grow.
Okay. So we want to remind our viewers that we're speaking with David Brock about hemp farming in Nebraska. We have our podcast, so we hope listeners are enjoying this particular topic. So based on what we've been talking about, it sounds like Nebraska won't really have to make many major changes to its program to meet the USDA guidelines, or will it?
Well, I think it probably, because Nebraska really had no program before, it's going to all be new. And so
Okay.
one would assume that, and basically the way the structure works is they'll have to follow the USDA program. And, I think that because of that, and because it didn't have another program that they have to try and align it with, it's most likely that the Nebraska Department of Ag is going to take the Hemp Farming Act and the Farm Bill and say, okay, what do those things require and try and write regulations that fit within that.
That fit within, okay. Now, there's a pretty tight window. I mean, states have to submit their hemp plans to the USDA by December 31st of this year, 2019. And then they plan to have a comment period before, well, I thought before submitting the plan, but do we know when that will be, and if the Nebraska Farmers Union, or you'll be speaking to that during that comment period?
Sure. Well, there will be a comment period, but what my understanding is that, and this makes sense just thinking about the process, is that the Nebraska Department of Ag, and I'm aware of, they've been working on the plan even before the USDA regulations came out. Okay. So now they're finalizing that, and the intent then is that they'll submit that to USDA to confirm that the state plan complies with the Farm Bill. Okay. And that's really how the Farm Bill is contemplated to work, is that USDA just says, yes, you meet the federal requirements, state, go do what you want. Then my understanding is the department will convert those into state regulations that'll be published for public comment, and that there'll be a public hearing sometime after USDA approves the state plan.
Okay. So sometime after the first of the year, we probably should
undoubtedly,
see that.
yes,
so,
yes.
So would it be reasonable to think that the state, the Department of Agriculture, would tweak the proposal at all based on public comment that comes?
I think the answer is yes. That's the purpose of public comment, but within the confines of what's required to conform with the 2018 Farm Bill.
Okay. So what kind of opportunities do we see in agribusiness for farmers with hemp farming opening up for Nebraska?
Well, I think that there's a lot of, certainly a lot of hope for opportunities. This is going to be a very interesting crop, because there's actually three things that you can get from a hemp plant. Hemp seed, and if you've been in a grocery store, or particularly in a natural food store, hemp seed is something. The fiber is something that's historically been used, and then I'd mentioned the CBD. So they're all three different products. However, again, because, well, the hemp seed and the hemp fiber had been somewhat available, CBD oil hadn't really been widely available, so it's to be seen how quickly those markets grow.
But there are other products, though, that can be made from hemp, rope, and I mean, in the far past, in the early part of the 20th century, rope was made from hemp primarily.
And so that's the of the three things that I talked about, that fiber. So the fibers that are in the stalks of a hemp plant are really strong, and that's why they were used in particularly in canvas and ropes and sailcloth and clothing, and we're back to having that again. I saw one of the national sporting good clothing had a whole catalog on hemp-based cloths. And clothing that they had. So that's an opportunity, again, one that hadn't been widely available just because of the nature of the crop. That's now, I think, is thought to be growing and have a lot of potential for it.
And paper that can be produced, so lots of products.
Yes.
Okay, it's in beauty products and foodstuffs as well?
So, and I'm aware of different, in fact, have worked with some companies that are looking at putting CBD oil in their cosmetics and soap products, which would be something that the FDA already has said they could do.
So should we look at hemp farming as a way for a small family farmer to sort of stay in the business of farming?
Well, it really depends, and one of the reasons for that is the hemp product, depending on what you're growing it for, can be very expensive to grow. And in fact, what I've seen in different literature, that just the planting of the hemp plants, if you're going to be using them for CBD, can cost as much as $10,000 an acre, just for 1 year's crop, just to put the plants in. And USDA's regulation said that the total cost could be as much as $25,000 an acre cost. And just by way of comparison, to put in an acre of corn, not counting the rental on the land, you'd probably only be looking like $400 or $500. And so it really is a significant cost.
Why is it so expensive?
Well, part of it is, again, for CBD, and I want to distinguish that between the hemp seed and the hemp fiber. But where that CBD oil, and for that matter, if it was a marijuana plant, where the marijuana, the THC is at, is largely in the flower. but it has to be in a female plant that hasn't been pollinated.
Okay.
And so then the farmer has to start out having feminized seed, usually starting them in a greenhouse, then planting them, then trying to be sure that there aren't any plants that are getting pollinated by whether stray pollen or if some male plant got in there. And all of that really adds to the cost.
Okay. How about opportunities for producing products that use hemp within the state? Do we see that as something that agribusiness will get into here?
So agribusiness and manufacturing, we have had in Nebraska a couple of companies that have been working on the equipment for harvesting hemp. And in fact, a company I'm aware of, and they had started that their equipment for the flaxseed and linen business that had largely been in Canada. That's usable in the hemp market. And then on the other end of the spectrum, really the products that it's going in, I'm aware of a couple companies that have Nebraska roots that are looking at putting CBD in particular in their personal care products like soaps and lotions.
Okay. We just have about a minute left or so, if anyone wants more information about the hemp farming and hemp farming in Nebraska, how would they find that information?
Well, one thing is I would say both the Nebraska Department of Agriculture's website and the USDA Department of Agriculture, or United States Department of Agriculture, have a lot of information and details on their websites. Certainly I'm monitoring it, and so you can always call me at my law firm at QTech Rock. So there is going to be a lot of information, and I anticipate we're going to see growing news about it as well. So it'll probably be, to some respects, something you can't avoid.
Okay. Any last words? You had a quote that you like about the issue.
So one of the things, and I think it goes back to what I was saying about the cost. The USDA Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs is Greg Ibaugh. That's his name that might be familiar to some of the viewers because he was the Nebraska Department of Agriculture Director at the same time I was the Director of Energy. And he was in the state in July, and he made what I think is the best quote that I've heard yet. And he said specifically that before a farmer thinks about growing hemp, he needs three things. He needs a plan, he needs a processor, in other words, someone he's going to sell that crop to, and he needs patience. And any one of those three are missing, a farmer really has the risk of having things not turn out very well. So again, a plan, a processor, and patience is going to be important.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here to talk about this. For the League of Women Voters, I'm Jerry Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, and at election time, go vote, Omaha.